This is an audio course. Thank you for listening.
You've written a couple books which are helping resolve an issue that our listeners have been asking with regard to difficult bosses and coworkers, how to deal with them well. And you've got a wealth of expertise. Maybe you could start us off by telling any particularly noteworthy stories about a bad boss or bad collaborators that might make our jaws drop and captivate us. No pressure, Sam.
Well, you know what? The origin story for Tung Fu actually does that is that Dr. Rei Oshiro out of University of Hawaii had asked me to do a program on dealing with difficult people without becoming one ourselves. At our first break, there was a gentleman. He didn't even get up to get a cup of coffee, some fresh air. He just sat there gazing off into space. And I was curious. I went over. I said, "What are you thinking?" And he said, "Sam, I'm a realtor." He said, "I would deal with some really demanding people, and they seem to think they can treat me any way they want to. I'm tired of it." He said, "I thought you were going to teach us some zingers to fire back at people and put them in their place." He said, "That's not what this is about." And he was the one who said, "I'm a student of martial arts." He said, "I've studied karate, taekwondo, judo." He said, "What you're talking about is not about putting people in their place, right? It's about putting ourselves in their place so we can respond with compassion instead of contempt." And he said, "It's kind of like a verbal form of Kung Fu, isn't it?" Eureka, the perfect title. That's what it is. Tung Fu, martial arts for the mind and mouth.
Can you give us an example of how that could play out conversationally?
Oh boy, can I give you an example? So now, Pete, unless people are driving and listening to this, I hope they grab paper and I hope they put a vertical line right down the center and put words to lose on the left and words to use on the right. Because we're going to go right into what we face every day on the job. So on the left, put complain, right? Because we hear complaints, customers complain, coworkers complain. So put complain over on the left. Guess what we don't do when people complain? Explain. Put explain on the left because explanations come across as excuses. If someone says, "Hey, this Zoom call was supposed to start at 9:00. Oh, I know. It's just some people are late." Nope. Explanations make people angrier because they feel we're not being accountable. Over on the right, put A train. When people complain, don't explain. Take the A train. A for agree. You're right. The Zoom call was supposed to start at 9:00. Apologize. And I'm sorry. We're running a few minutes late. Act. And I've got that information you'd requested. Let's jump right into it. Rock and roll. Do you see how the A train expedites complaints and explanations aggravate them?
So agree, apologize, and act. And not to get too into the weeds here, but when something is late, you suggest the act there is just, and we're just going to get started now. Any alternatives coming to mind?
Absolutely. Here's another one. Say people are arguing, right? Say something's gone wrong and people are finger pointing, blaming, shaming. Over on the left, put find fault, right? Well, hey, it wasn't my fault. So-and-so was in charge of it. Well, I never saw that memo. Back and forth we go. Finding fault serves no good purpose. Over on the right, put find solutions. And when people are arguing and it is this blaming, shaming, interrupt them and then say these magic words. "Hey, we could argue for the rest of the day and that's not going to get this done. Instead, let's figure out how we're going to prevent this from happening again. Or instead, let's put a system in place." And you see how when we switch the attention to finding solutions instead of fault, now that conversation is serving a good purpose instead of a waste of everyone's time. Now, over on the left, put negative accusation. Say somebody says, "You women are so emotional." If we deny a negative accusation, if we say, "We're not emotional," we just proved their point. If someone says, "You don't care about your customers," and we say, "We do too care about our customers," now we're proving their point, right? So on the left, instead of denying an accusation, over on the right, redirect an accusation. I'll give you 2 quick examples. I was speaking at a conference and a woman put her hand up in the Q&A and she said, Sam, why are women so catty to each other? I decided to Don Draper that, Pete. Don Draper and Mad Men said, if you don't like what's being said, change the conversation. So I said, ladies, let's agree to never ask or answer that question again, because every time we do, we perpetuate that stereotype. Instead, don't repeat a negative accusation because it reinforces it. Instead, redirect it. Say, you know what I found? Women are real champions of each other. In fact, I wouldn't have this job if someone hadn't stepped up and recommended me. Or here's another thing you can do on the right. Instead of repeating it, which reinforces it, say, what do you mean? Or why do you say that? Because if someone says you don't care about your customers and we say we do too, we're in a debate. If you say, well, why do you say that? They may say, well, I've left 3 messages and no one's called back. What do you mean or why do you say that gets to the root of the accusation, and we can solve that instead of reacting to the attack. Let's talk about when something goes wrong, shall we?
All right.
Okay, someone's made a mistake. Someone's dropped the ball, right? Isn't it true that that word should is right there on the tip of our tongue? You should have been more careful. You should have brought that up in the staff meeting. You should have asked George. He's handled that before. And yet the word should comes across as a critic. People will resent us even if what we're saying is right. So over on the left, put mistake. The word should punishes the past. No one can undo the past. They will resent us even if what we're saying is right. Over on the right, we're going to shape behavior instead of should it. And with these words next time, from now on, in the future. Because if we say from now on, if you have questions, please bring them up in the staff meeting, because other people are probably wondering the same thing. In the future, if that happens, if you could, do you see how we're being a coach instead of a critic? We're shaping behavior instead of shaming it, and people are learning from their mistakes instead of losing face over their mistakes.
I'm thinking now, let's say the listener finds themselves in the victim seat, or they are the ones being blamed. They are the ones that people are finding fault with. How do you recommend we deal with the emotional stuff there and find our way forward effectively?
Well, and a lot of people find themselves in this situation these days, right? We have to enforce policies we don't agree with, or we need to tell someone there's nothing we can do, or we're thinking, hey, it's not my fault. Guess what? Over on the left, put the words, there's nothing, or it's not my fault. Because if something goes wrong and people are blaming us and we're saying, hey, not my fault, nothing I can do, no way I can change it, do you feel that people are concluding we don't care? So over on the right, put there's something instead of there's nothing. And I'm really going to give you one of my favorite examples of this. My Aunt Kay is 80 years old, and she still volunteers 5 days a week to go to her local hospital and to work from the 4 to 8 shift. So I said, what's it been like these last few months with COVID? And she said, Sam, it's so stressful because we have a policy with only 1 visitor per patient. And, you can imagine these people, I'm the point of contact. They're taking all their anger out on me. And I said, well, what's a specific example? And she said, last week, a woman came rushing in. She held up her phone. She said, my daughter just texted. She's in ER. I need to see her. And so Aunt Kay called the ER, and the nurse said somebody's already with the daughter. The mom could not get in to see her. So the mother, understandably, goes ballistic and is taking all that anger out at Aunt Kay. Now, she could have said, hey, I'm not the one who did the policy. Don't blame me. Instead, she said, let me see if there's something, instead of there's nothing, that we can do. She called and she asked the ER nurse, who is with the daughter? It was the Uber driver who had brought her in from the accident. Well, they explained the situation to the Uber driver, thanked him. He left. The mom got in to see the daughter. And that is a shift in mentality. You use that word victim, And if we're being blamed for something that's not our fault, the more we think, hey, this isn't fair, don't blame me, the angrier we get at them, and we perpetuate that. Instead, if we say, this won't help, let's focus on what we can do, there's something we can figure out, it shifts the whole situation. And by the way, Pete, this is why I juxtapose things. That's why we put a column on the left of something's gone wrong. And Elvis Presley, of all people, has a great quote about this. Do you know what he said? He said, when things go wrong, don't go with them.
Okay.
So see, on the left, when things go wrong, we can find fault. We can tell them it's not our fault, and it will not help. So we shift over to the right to these responses instead of reactions. Here's one of my favorite examples. I often close my Tung Fu programs with this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. She said, no one can make us feel inferior without our consent. And I've adapted that with credit to her to say no one can make us angry without our consent. And there was a gruff construction boss, and he stood up and he said, Sam, you're pulling a Pollyanna with this one. He said, you have no idea the kind of people I deal with. Do you mean if someone's yelling in my face, that's not supposed to make me mad? And there was a woman who stood up and she said, I'm a surgical nurse. She said, I agree with this because I've lived through it. I deal with a neurosurgeon who's the most abrasive individual I have ever met. He is a brilliant physician. He has zip people skills. She said, last year I was a fraction of a second late handing him an instrument in surgery. He berated me in front of my peers. He humiliated me in front of that team. It took all my professionalism just to continue with the operation and not walk out. She said, when I was driving home, I got so mad at him. I sat down at the dinner table. I told my husband what happened. I said, oh, that doctor makes me mad. She said, my husband had heard this before. He said, Judy, what time is it? She said, it's 7:00. He said, what time did this happen? She said, 9:00 this morning. He said, Judy, is it the doctor who's making you mad? And he got up and left the table. And she said, I sat there and I thought about it and I realized it wasn't the doctor who was making me mad. The doctor wasn't even in the room. She said, I was the one who'd given him a ride home in my car. I was the one who'd set him a place at my dinner table. I decided right there and then that never again was that doctor welcome in my home or in my head. And when I left the hospital, I was leaving him there, and never again was I giving him the power to poison my personal life. And so I'm asking all our listeners, Pete, who do we take home with us? Who do we give a ride to in our car? Who do we set a place for at our dinner table? And can we promise ourselves that we will leave that person at work? We will no longer give them the power to poison that precious personal time with our loved ones at home.
Well, Sam, now that is inspiring and wise. That being said, when the rubber meets the road and you're in the heat of battle, it can be sometimes easier said than done when ruminations start to crop up. How do you recommend we, put the kibosh on them?
Oh, Pete, I love that question. That's the perfect follow-up question, right? Is I agree with you in theory. How do I do it in practice? And what you just brought up, we cannot not think about something, right? If we tell our kids don't run around the pool, what are they going to do? If I say I'm not going to get mad, what are we going to do? If we're an athlete and we say don't double fault or don't drop the ball, what are we going to do? You are right. Instead of saying I'm not going to let that person make me mad, I'm not going to take that person home with me. Over on the left is what we don't want. Over on the right is what we do want. So it's called catch and correct. As soon as we become aware whether we are telling ourselves what we don't want, you better not be late again. Don't forget, stop hitting your sister, don't get angry. That's over on the left. No, switch over to the right. What do you want? Well, you want to stay calm. You want to focus on what's right in your world. You want to look at this person across the table as if for the first or last time so that you see them and you are present to them instead of preoccupied with what happened 10 years before. We want to tell our kids, Give your sister space. A hula hoop is space, which is something to do instead of stop hitting your sister. We want to say be 5 minutes early instead of don't be late. It's remember to tell your boss this when you walk in the morning instead of don't forget. So you are right, is that we fill our mind with words and language and images of what we do want instead of telling ourselves what we don't. So if people are thinking, oh, this is this woo-woo Pollyanna stuff, what if this person is really egregious? What if what they're doing, I'm just supposed to ignore it? So here is the bottom line action we can take as well. There's the mindset, and there's also then the mechanics of pragmatic action. When we're not happy with the situation, there's 3 things we can do. We can change the other person. We can change a situation. We can change ourselves. So we jump to number 3, changing ourselves. Let's look at the first 2. Here is the good news. There is strength in numbers. And so changing the other person in many industries these days, it used to be that if this neurosurgeon was a rainmaker, even if the nurses were complaining, administrators didn't care because this neurosurgeon was famous and a rainmaker. Now there is strength in numbers. And if you document the behavior, if you have witnesses to the behavior, if you report objectively with the W's, what was said, when was this said? What was the impact of what was said? And it is reported to HR. They are required to act on documented reports of egregious behavior that is not subjective. I didn't like what this person said.
Yeah, he was rude. I was bullied. That's a little bit subject to interpretation as opposed to he said, you are a moron and I hate you. It's like, okay, that's a direct quote.
And that's why what you just said, Pete, about it needs to be the dialogue, not like he was really offensive. HR can't do anything with that, or a business owner can't do anything with that. When you quote what someone was said, when you put the time that it happened, not yesterday, no, it happened at 9:17, right in the middle of this, the more objective evidence of this unacceptable behavior, the more actionable it is. So we can maybe change the other person. We can change a situation. Now, you maybe think, well, I don't want to switch to another department, or I've got 3 more years in this government job. I'm not going to retire, or something like that. So sometimes, though, we can change the situation. And the good news is, even if we can't change the person or can't change a situation, even if you decide that person's a jerk, I've done everything I can, no one's taking responsibility, and I don't want to quit, I don't want to leave, I need this, then that third act is always an option, and we change ourselves. We could almost put like a plastic bubble around us, and whatever that person says just bounces off of it. It never gets under our skin. It never invades us so that we're still thinking about it a day or a week or a month later.
And we talked about changing the other person, and one pathway is the, documentation, building a case, HR, business owner, senior executive, kind of direct challenge in that way. Do you have any suggestions in terms of how one might do this delicate diplomatic dance associated with, hey, boss, when you did this, I didn't like that. Any thoughts for how to have that conversation, like when and how and if?
Okay, so now we're going to move into bully territory here, because I believe 95% of people care what's fair. I believe 95% of people have a conscience. They actually want to cooperate. They want a win-win. Guess what? 5%ers, they don't want a win-win. They want to win. They don't want to cooperate. They want to control. They don't follow the rules. They break the rules because they know that it's going to get them what they want. So if we are dealing with someone at work and this person is a 5%er, and that means they have a pattern of violating people's rights, of not playing by the rules. It's not a one time they're not having a bad day. It's like they do it all the time on purpose. I'm going to say something that flies in the face of everything you've heard. Ready?
All righty.
Do not use the word I. Because haven't we been taught, Pete, that we're supposed to say, I don't think that's fair. I don't like to be spoken to in that tone of voice. Guess what? Bullies don't care what's fair. They don't have a conscience. They're actually going to think, good, I'm glad it's bothering you. It was supposed to bother you. I am going to suggest we use the word you. You, back off. You, enough. You, speak to me with respect. So here are just a variety of ways to do that. You, that's enough. That's the last time you say that to me. And when we say it standing tall with our shoulders up and back, instead of our shoulders crunched up like this, which is just the weak submissive position, then essentially what we're saying is that we are letting that person know that doesn't work here anymore.
Is there ever a time in which we should consider just exiting that situation entirely? How do we know that this is where we are in terms of the hopeless situation?
I'm just so glad you brought that up. Tennessee Williams said, sometimes it is time to leave even when there is no particular place to go. And toward the end, after all of these pragmatic things that you can do to improve the situation, to stand up and speak up for yourself, etc., if none of that works, then it's time for us to remove ourselves from the situation and to make sure to not see it as a failure. So a good friend said, you know, Sam, William Blake said that we are all born innocent, and at some point we will encounter evil. And at that point, we either become embittered and we see the world as a dark place and it defines and defeats us. Or we become, are you ready for two really fantastic words, Pete? Informed innocence. And informed innocence are no longer naive or idealistic. We understand that evil exists. We understand that there are people out there who will wreak havoc and they will not be responsible for the consequences. And that removing ourselves from the sphere of that individual is not defeat. It is us stepping up on behalf of what we believe. And that is that people treat each other with respect. People act with integrity. And if we have tried everything and this person is not going to change and the situation is going to change, then I am going to remove myself from it and align myself with people who do act in integrity and do behave responsibly, because that's how I believe life is supposed to be.